And we decided that we were going to talk about integration. I think that was what we advertised. Vaishnava etiquette in relation to integration. So what does integration mean? Well, one of the principles that is taught in our scriptures is to not be duplicitous. And the word duplicitous means two. And the way Prabhupada defines it is that a person's actions, or what appears to be his actions externally, and his actions in private are different. Or it can mean that one's actions externally appear to be genuine and straightforward, but internally the motives are not genuine, and actually motives could be deceitful, or could be, the motives are not aligned with the actions. The actions appear to be pure, but the motive may be impure. So you have two examples here of something which is integrated. And the word integrity means to integrate. And so the first example we give of integration would mean what you do in public is also the same as what you do in private. Just like George Harrison said. He said, the one thing about Prabhupada is whatever he wrote in his books is also what he said when I was with him, and it's also what he did. So there wasn't two Prabhupads, the one that he shows to the world as the guru, and then somebody else. Another word which is given is sarlata, sarlata, S-A-R-L-A-T-A, which Prabhupada defines in the Chaitanya Charitamrita as simplicity. And simplicity, he gives the definition of simplicity to mean the same thing as being non-duplicitous, or the same thing as integrity. Simplicity means that, like we say in America, what you see is what you get. So, what you see in the person is what the person is. It's not that you see something and the person is different. Now, integration in Krishna consciousness would mean that we are practicing to act according to the directions of Scripture, or according to the characteristics and qualities of the pure devotee. Jai Jai everyone. Jai Jai Gopal, Alexi Anuradha Premikishore, Mahatmatmananda Palak Anusha Marina. Sounds like a song, right? Jaya Jaya Gopal, Alexi Anuradha Premikishore, Mahatma Atmananda Palak Panir Anusha Marina. Jai 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 Jai. So, Gauranga Nityananda. So, there's so many verses in Srimad Bhagavatam and so many verses in Bhagavad Gita and all throughout our scriptures which, and choral. Oh, choral here. Jai Jai Choral. Estefania ki jai. So, if you study any of our books, you'll see there's so many qualities listed as the qualities of those who are pure, and also there are many qualities listed of those who are not pure, but the qualities that someone who's trying to become pure should follow, should exhibit in their life. And of course, we should try to exhibit all good qualities. So, when we talk about integration, then it doesn't mean that we have to have those qualities, because those qualities will develop as we advance in devotional service. But what it means to be integrated, it means to act upon those qualities. So you don't have a certain quality, it doesn't mean you don't act on it. And that's an illusion. And I think some people. I woke Palak up. I woke him up. I called his name. So to think, well, I don't have certain qualifications because I'm not on a elevated stage of Krishna consciousness means that I'm not expected to exhibit those qualities in my behavior is wrong. Now what it means is you're not expected to naturally exhibit those qualities. You're not expected to exhibit those qualities as a manifestation of prema, but it is expected that you should exhibit those qualities as a manifestation of sadhana, either vaidhi sadhana or raganuga sadhana. Sadhana means practice. So, any quality which a devotee should manifest in their life is manifested through the practice. So we say, if you want to be humble, then we say, the practice of humility is paved. No, the path to humility is paved with the practice of humility. If you want to be, what is another quality Krishna says? The devotee is titikshava karunika surita sarvade. The devotee is merciful. The devotee is tolerant. Surita sarvadeinam. He's a friend to everyone. All right, so friend to everyone means that I'm everyone's well-wisher. So, am I at heart everyone's well-wisher? Maybe not, probably not till I'm elevated in Krishna consciousness, at least according to our scripture. It won't happen until I have love for Krishna. But Prabhupada asked us to distribute Krishna consciousness. And that is a manifestation of that quality of being merciful and being everyone's well-wisher. So one time a devotee asked Prabhupada, he said, well, what if I'm not compassionate? How do I exhibit compassion? And Prabhupada said, serve the movement of compassion. In other words, serve ISKCON, by serving in ISKCON, the activities which you're engaged in are naturally activities of compassion because they're aimed at helping people. So serve the movement of compassion. So I may not be compassionate, but I can have actions which could be defined as compassionate, at least externally I'm engaged in compassionate activities. So then you might say, well, but you're saying integrity means to be aligned outside and inside, and if inside I'm not compassionate, but I'm outside acting compassionately, that would mean I'm out of alignment. No, it doesn't actually mean that. It means that internally you understand that this is how you should behave. And it means that internally you may not be spontaneously, or you may not spontaneously develop the characteristics or qualities of a particular nature. So in this example, if we use humility or we use compassion, say, I may not be humble by nature, or I may not be compassionate by nature. That's not my natural state because I'm conditioned, but I act that way. And so therefore the integrity is the integrity with what I'm dedicated to. So I'm being directed by my spiritual master. I'm being directed by scripture to be compassionate. And so I'm dedicated to that, at least in the sense that I understand this is what I should do. I understand it's right. I'm being ordered to do it. And so now by acting compassionately, even if the compassion is not fully developed within my heart, which would be an example of, well, am I really the well-wisher of Surita Sarvadehinam? No, but I'm acting like it. Because that's how a devotee should act. So because I'm acting on it, then I'm representing the behavior of a devotee. Because I don't have control of those realizations. I don't have control that I will feel compassion or I will feel as a well-wisher to everyone. I don't have control of that because that's something that comes at a more advanced stage. But what I do have control of is acting that way. So you have to understand the difference. And so it's not artificial if you say, I act that way even if I don't feel it. And the reason it's not artificial is because you won't feel that until you're more advanced. And you can only feel that spontaneously and naturally on a higher level of Krishna consciousness. So if you don't feel it, it doesn't mean that you now have the right not to act that way until you feel it. But as I've said many times, the way you come to the realization, or the way you come to develop the qualities fully, is by practicing them. So you're acting that way now. Does that make sense? I mean, what other alternative is there? You can't wait for it to develop. You have to act according to what's right. And so that's the integration. Now, the real key is for each of us as individuals to look at our lives and say, do my lives represent what Prabhupada is teaching in his books is a devotee? Do I represent that in my words, in my thoughts, and in my actions? Because we can represent it in words, thoughts, and actions. As I'm saying, even if we don't have that fully. So then I have to look at my life and do a little analysis. Okay, let me take a quality like cleanliness. Do I manifest cleanliness in my life? Am I neat? Am I clean? Am I organized? Am I a slob? Am I dirty? Am I disorganized? Okay, so let's say you are a slob. That's your nature. You have slob shakti. You were born with slob shakti. And you nurtured slob shakti your whole life. And let's say you're disorganized. That's your nature. You're just not a super organized person. Let's say cleanliness is not important for you. It never has been. You know, you wear the same jeans for a week or two before you wash them, no problem. Even sometimes you sleep in them at night and you just wear them for a few more days. No problem. You've got, no problem with that. And you might say, actually, I have no problem with this because I'm Krishna conscious. I'm so detached. I don't care. No, Prabhupada said it's because you're in the mode of ignorance. That's why. We're making a distinction between what I am internally and how I can behave externally. There's a saying that you want to honor somebody, then you create a community which lives their teachings, and that's how you honor someone. So if we take that idea personally, then we can say, well, we honor Prabhupada by living what he taught, by being an example of what he taught. And I have said before that when we first came to India and we asked Prabhupada, well, what will we do? Because it was just festivals, there wasn't really much service. He said, just by you coming, if you act properly, then that's your preaching, because people will see you and they'll be impressed that you're acting as a Paka Vaishnava. So how we act is a very powerful form of preaching. When we first started doing parikramas here in Mayapur, you'd go out for a few weeks and you'd go to all these holy places and you'd walk. And the leaders of the parikrama said that everybody has to walk without shoes because traditionally parikrama is done without shoes. And if you wear shoes, then the people, they won't take you seriously as a devotee. They won't think you're genuine. So by not wearing shoes, you're preaching. You're showing that you're a proper Vaishnava. This is what Vaishnavas do when they do parikrama. So in our actions, in our dealings, if we act as more and more we act as devotees should act, that also sends a very good example to people who see how we're acting. And because if you're practicing Krishna consciousness and anybody knows you're practicing it, then they're always going to look at you and they're going to expect certain things of you. I've seen this so many times. Sometimes I'd bring my sister to the temple in Los Angeles, then she would see different devotees doing different things. And if somebody wasn't doing something that in her mind was Krishna conscious, she would say, why is he doing that? Isn't a devotee not supposed to do that? She'd always pick up on it. So from that, I understood that when you become a devotee and you take up, you become part of a mission, then people expect you to act in a particular way. I mean, it's just like you're supposed to be a sadhu or saintly, so they'll have certain expectations. And sometimes if you let them down, then what happens? Then they're like, what's wrong with you? You know, why aren't you following this? So, of course, we know we can't be perfect, but they don't know that. They expect us to be perfect. Then, in a sense, we're a little bit on stage, and it's service to Prabhupada, service to Krishna, to act properly. Now, and then by doing that, we're glorifying Prabhupada. Isn't that interesting? We're actually glorifying Prabhupada by acting, at least externally, or acting according to his instructions. So, you may know that Prabhupada was asked, well, how do you know who is a devotee? And Prabhupada said, he said, you'll know because they're perfect gentlemen. Alexei Anusha is saying, they don't know we're trying to be devotees. Well, if anybody does know you're trying to be a devotee, then they're going to expect you to act like one. They're going to expect you to act as a perfect gentleman or a perfect lady, because this was Prabhupada's description of a devotee. He's a perfect gentleman or he's a perfect lady. So, last week we were talking about this verse of Bhagavad Gita where you speak, like not all Christians are good, but it becomes a paradox that you are defining yourself as a religious person, as a spiritual person, and so your real definition is how you act, how you behave, how you deal with others. So the point is that we need to notice, become aware, and deal with all the non-Krishna conscious tendencies within our heart, all the non-Krishna conscious behavior. We need to become aware of it, and then we need to ask ourselves, is this acceptable? Is this behavior acceptable? Or is there another way which Prabhupada would want me to act, or Prabhupada would expect me to act? We need to it's very helpful for your spiritual practice to be aware, and I think aware of this. And I think a lot of times we may do something or say something that really should not be done or said by a devotee. And the harm or the crime in that is not so much as doing it, but as not recognizing we're doing it. You understand? So it's one thing you do the wrong thing, and then sometimes we'll do the wrong thing because we're conditioned, right? But it's another thing to do the wrong thing and not notice it. And today we're having a discussion. Then there's another step. To do the wrong thing, not notice it, but other people notice it and point it out, and you don't admit it. Then it's just like you're taking it up really high now. It's bad enough to do the wrong thing. It's worse that you're not even aware you're doing the wrong thing, and even worse when people point it out and you deny it. And so, as we said last week, humility is really the foundation of being a Vaishnava and the foundation of Vaishnava relationships. And so, if some defect is pointed out within us and we reject it, it's not indicative of the way a Vaishnava would behave. If a devotee thinks, I'm good, I'm great, I'm perfect, I'm fine, there's nothing wrong with me, there really couldn't be any worse thinking than that. I mean, that's actually, for a devotee, that's like the lowest possible consciousness you could be in, because it is directly opposed to Trinadapi Sunicina. You can't get any further from that. So a devotee should not think, I'm a great devotee, I'm an advanced devotee, I'm a better devotee. And so that's like the death knell for a devotee. It's like when we think that way, we're finished. So if we make some mistake and it's pointed out and we fight it, we deny it, then we're acting quite contrarily to the nature of a real Vaishnava. And so it may be difficult for us if somebody points out our faults. We may not like it, it may not feel good, but at least we should understand it's not the way a devotee behaves. So when we're in these situations where there's interchange with devotees, where there's a little friction and somebody's hurting somebody else, somebody's accusing somebody else of something, and all this is going on, then we have to look at ourselves and say, okay, what's going on within me now? And so quite often we get angry, we get upset, we retaliate, we may say something nasty. But my point is, if you are trying to evolve your Krishna consciousness to a point where, as far as possible, you try to behave ideally, even if you don't feel like behaving ideally, but that's where your consciousness is situated, that's where your intention is situated. Then if you're in that consciousness, then when you're provoked, there would be less of a chance of you responding with something that isn't Krishna conscious, because your intention is to model Krishna consciousness as far as possible in every situation, even when you're provoked. And if you're not in that consciousness, if you're not in this awareness that I have to monitor my actions, I have to see how my actions are Krishna conscious, then it's very easy to do things which aren't Krishna conscious, and you just don't even notice, you're not even aware that you're thinking in the wrong way, you've said the wrong thing, or you've done the wrong thing. As strange as that sounds, as weird as that sounds, because you would think, no, it should be obvious when I do something wrong. Well, it's not always obvious. If it were so obvious, why did you do it? Right? You wouldn't have done it if it's so obvious. So that's the point. You understand? So now, let's go back to this example that you have an organization, or you have a city or a town or a village or a community, and you want to honor the person whose teachings you are following. You honor him by manifesting his teachings within that community. So now we look at our temples, we look at our families. Families are communities, temples are communities. We may have farm communities. And we have to look at them and say, where are these communities not aligned with what Prabhupada teaches in terms of how devotees relate, how service is done, how leadership is enacted? And then we have to try to help align those communities in a way that you could actually understand the philosophy of Krishna consciousness just by seeing how the people live. Wouldn't that be nice? In other words, you might think, like we do the exercise in the forgiveness workshop, that if you were observed, but you couldn't talk to anybody and tell anybody what you believe, but if you were just observed, if your life was observed, and they had to determine what you believe, what would they determine? So you could pose that same question to any Hare Krishna community and say, if somebody saw this community but never spoke personally to any of the members of the community, but just saw what the community members did, they heard what community members spoke about, what would they understand the philosophy of Krishna consciousness? Or would they come to understand that the members of this community believe something that we actually don't believe, but it appears we believe it because of our behavior? So it's an interesting way of looking at our organization, but I think it can be a beneficial and healthy way if we, as individuals and as a group, try to bring our communities more in line with what Prabhupada wanted. Now, one of the things that when we do this, and when we also try to analyze our own life, one of the things that we realize is that when we become devotees, we bring things with us that don't belong to Krishna consciousness. We bring a nature from many, many lifetimes. We bring habits from many, many lifetimes. And so we're supposed to kind of put those somewhere and lock them up because we don't want to use them, and then we want to work on them and purify them. But a lot of times those things, they enter center stage. And in the name of service or Krishna consciousness, we can manifest through behavior which is not anywhere related to Krishna consciousness. That's where we have trouble. So what we're saying, or what we're trying to do, is understand that getting this integrity between what Krishna consciousness is and how we act individually and how we act as communities. The problem is that when we're trying to merge, we have a habitual direction of our life, and then you have this Krishna consciousness which is going on this track, and we have this track. And so when we oscillate to this track, we oscillate to that conditioned side, then it's like the conditioned side is dominating and Krishna consciousness is underneath. But we want to put Krishna consciousness on top so that it can suppress, should I go out the screen? So it can suppress the non-Krishna consciousness, the conditioned side. Of course we say it will purify it, but before it's entirely purified, it suppresses it to a great degree. And we need to be aware of what our conditioned nature is, and we need to be aware of those things which can get in the way of my properly executing Krishna consciousness, or executing Krishna consciousness on a higher level. So maybe your problem is that you have very little tolerance. It's just how you are. So at least if you're aware of it, and you know you need to work on it, you can work on it. And when you begin to become intolerant, then because of your awareness of it, you'll tend less to give into it. You'll just say, oh, this is my nature, I'm intolerant. I have to learn to be more tolerant. I have to try harder than other devotees because I'm less tolerant than other devotees. So, at least you're aware of the problem and you're trying to do something about it. But if you're not even aware of the problem, then what happens is when the problem comes up, you don't even realize it's a problem. And that's the problem. So then you're intolerant and you're acting in intolerant ways. It doesn't even dawn on you that you're doing that. When Krishna consciousness is so much dependent on tolerance and patience and humility. Bhaktisiddhanta said that these are the qualities that are our only friends in our practice of sadhana. Patience, tolerance, humility. Trinadapi sunichena. And so, if you don't realize you're not manifesting these qualities when you're in situations where you're not manifesting them, you don't catch yourself, how are you going to improve? No, you know, if you've heard me speak, that I've spoken about this before, and the reason I'm speaking about it again is because I'm always confronted with this in seeing devotees who practice Krishna consciousness for many, many years, but they have certain nature which is very strong. It may be, they may have short tempers, they may not be very patient, they may by nature not be appreciative or whatever. And so the point is that these failings are hard to transcend, they're hard to purify, they stick with us, and you really have to want to deal with them. Of course, you have to, as we say, you have to acknowledge them, but you really have to want to deal with them. You really have to want to improve them. You really have to be self-reflective. Otherwise, they just tend to be so subtle that you manifest them, but you don't even know it. Yes? You manifest them. You're not even aware of it. I mean, other people are aware of it. Other people are affected by it. And so how can you improve yourself if you're not aware of it? So, we want to kind of monitor our dealings, particularly our dealings with one another, and see, am I acting in a Krishna conscious way? Now, you may do something that upsets me. That's okay. But how do I respond to that upset? We won't always get along, but how do I respond when we don't get along? So I'm not saying it's you're perfect and you're going to get along with everybody. No. I'm saying that internally you're not perfect, but the point is how you're going to respond. Yeah, we're going to be people that we have trouble with. There's going to be devotees we don't like dealing with. We're going to be devotees that we can't work with, or we can't work well with. But the question then is, how do you deal with that? It's a reality, okay, I'm not arguing that, but how do you deal with it? Tidikshava kurunika surida sarvadehinam ajato shatava shanta. He has no enemy. Ajata shatava. Shanta is peaceful. You have no, you don't do anything that would cause anyone to be your enemy. Always peaceful, shanti. Even when there's provocation, even when there's disturbance. Okay. So, there's a situation and one of you gets upset, and I'm not condemning you for getting upset, but I would condemn you for responding to that upset in a way which is not within the parameters of the practices of Krishna consciousness. We may disagree, we may heavily disagree, but how do we interact with that disagreement? All devotees are not going to agree on everything. It's just not the way it's going to be. I was just reading this article about the Mormon Church. And they have one branch which is called, the Mormon Church is called the Latter-day Saints, LDS. But they have a FLDS, and the FLDS is the Fundamentalist Latter-day Saints. And they broke off from the Mormon Church because the Mormon Church had changed some things, which I guess they didn't agree with. And then in Utah, there were 4 or 5 other branches that broke off from the original Mormon Church. So I'm reading this and I'm thinking, okay, you had this fundamentalist group of people, and so they were too conservative for the adaptions that the Mormon Church was making, and so they broke off. And then you have I forget the other groups, what they stood for. But it's just people have different natures, and so breaking off into groups not being able to work together is normal. But the point is, if 2 people disagree, how do they continue if they have to work together? You have a certain nature, and this person has a certain nature, and you don't get along. And so then you have to figure out what to do. So a lot of times when that happens, then it's like crunch, 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 crunch. Okay, so I'm not saying that everybody's going to get along perfectly. We're conditioned souls, we have different natures. But what I'm saying is, what do you do when you don't get along? How do you deal with it? How do you respond to it? Oh man, is it hot here? You have no idea. How do you respond to it when you don't get along? That's the point. So what is the Vaishnava way of dealing with it? Okay, so we recognize, okay, we don't get along, there's this problem, that problem. Do we offend one another? Do we attack one another? Do we yell at one another? Of course not. I mean, we do, that's the problem. But how should we act? We want to act in the mode of goodness. So we want to, in service to Prabhupada, come to some way of dealing with one another. If we can't work together in this area, maybe we can work together in this area, or maybe we have 2 separate areas. So we're working together but independently. Some way we work it out so we maintain the integrity of our own Krishna consciousness. We don't degrade ourselves because there's conflict, there's difficulty, or people have done things that we didn't appreciate, or they said things about us that were unkind. So that's what we're trying to do. Do we do it well all the time? No. But that's what we're trying to do. I mean, that's what Prabhupada wants us to do. And that's what culture means. Because culture, it manifests so much in relationships. It's at least in my experience, because I travel around the world, so I travel to different cultures, and I understand a lot about cultures because of the travel. And one of the main ways you understand culture is in how people relate to one another. Some cultures, people talk like this, some they hug, some they don't. Some they argue a lot, some they don't. And so how we relate to one another really shows up, really shows where our Krishna consciousness is. So that's important. Now, Palak has some questions. Palak says, sometimes things that are not considered Krishna consciousness, according to what I was taught, I feel are actually supporting my journey and making me conscious of Krishna as they're honest and expressing my nature. So what should I trust? That which is natural, or that which is coming from outside of me and making my heart shrink? I can't answer that question unless I know particularly what it is you're referring to. As a general principle, whatever makes you Krishna conscious. But then, what if you think it's Krishna consciousness and I don't? Then now we're in trouble. Right? So then we have to agree on what is Krishna consciousness. Maybe I think taking drugs is making me more Krishna conscious. But so there is some, there's some objectifying Krishna consciousness, like this is what it is and this is what it isn't, and this is Krishna conscious behavior and this isn't. And now you might say, well, I did something which isn't Krishna conscious behavior, and it made me Krishna conscious. We'll have to question that, is because in general, you don't do something which is not Krishna conscious and end up with Krishna consciousness. And just like you don't do something Krishna conscious and generally end up with not Krishna consciousness. Right? Now, making your heart shrink, sometimes you may have to discipline yourself, and you may call that heart shrinking. So then, that's a different, you see? Anyway, if I don't know the specifics, I can't answer the question. So, now, next question, next situation. I'll tell you a real life situation. The devotee was dealing with some conflict in his temple. And his temple president said something which was not flattering. That's a mild way of saying it. He said some things which were disturbing to this devotee. And maybe jumping to some assumption or making accusations based on what other people said. And then the temple president said, I want to speak to you. Like the next day he said that. And this devotee said, I won't be able to speak for a couple of days. And then he told me the reason he said that is because he was so disturbed that he felt that if he spoke, it wouldn't go well. And then he spoke with the temple president a few days later, and he said it went quite well. And he said it was a good choice. Now, so the moral of that is that you may feel a certain way because of certain situations, but you want to try to respond from the most Krishna conscious state you can possibly respond in. And sometimes if you respond when you're upset or disturbed, then you're going to say things which you regret. So, I thought that was instructive. And you also find that when you do email, sometimes you might be having correspondence with someone and you're upset about something, and it's always good to not hit the send button if you're upset. But then you want to... A lot of times when I'll just tell you my personal policy. If I'm sending an email, and particularly if it's about somebody, one rule of thumb I have is, if this person read this email, would we be able to maintain our relationship? Now, and sometimes I admit I might say something which would disturb a person only because I'm just acknowledging that the person did something disturbing. But as a general principle, I like to write in a way that I would not regret it if that person got that email. Because I figure if I do that, that kind of monitors my response, because a Vaishnava is always appreciative and sympathetic and non-critical. So I want to make sure that even though I'm being told someone has done something wrong, I want to make sure that in my response, the person would not be upset if they read it. Now, sometimes I slip, because sometimes people do things that are really wrong and it's really upsetting. And sometimes I think it's okay to be upset because what they've done is very wrong. So I'm not saying you can't be upset. In some situations you can be upset because a person has transgressed to such a degree Krishna conscious principles it would be awkward not to be upset. But again, your response should be monitored by Prabhupada's quote of devotees are perfect gentlemen. And I think if we act more like perfect ladies and gentlemen, we'll have a much better organization. So now it's time for the Harinam Chintamani. Prem Kachori. Prem Kachori. A kachori full of prema. Yeah, Prem Kachori. No, Prem Kishore Dasa says. Sorry this is long. What I get out of this is that one should really focus on themselves and make sure their actions are aligned with Krishna consciousness. However, I think after hearing a class like this, it's strangely easy to criticize others, like after reading the list of qualities of devotee in Bhagavad Gita and then going to the temple thinking, one should just focus on themselves. I read this yesterday and it helps me from not focusing on others and just focusing on myself. Quote, this is from Harinam Chintamani. When one has developed a taste for chanting the pure name, it is said that chanting just one time will destroy the influence of all past sins. Some remnants of those sins may still remain, but they will completely vanish by the influence of the holy name. Since these traces of sin will quickly go, that person is known as the most righteous person. Of course, if the materialist sees those traces of sin in a Vaishnava sadhu, he may consider that the sadhu is just like a materialistic sinner. If he should criticize the sadhu because the sadhu has a trace of sin coming from previous sinful activity, he is committing sadhu ninda. He is to be considered a rascal because of his fault of criticizing a Vaishnava. And by this nam aparad, offense unto one who has surrendered to the name, he falls directly under the wrath of Krishna. The thing that really blew my mind was that the next paragraph, it says that one should not criticize a Vaishnava, and that a Vaishnava can be someone who chanted the holy name even just one time. They're semi-Vaishnava. Has inspired me to look more at my own actions. Yes. Okay, let's talk about that. I think one really interesting point that you make, and I've noticed this, is that when you learn what the right behavior is, then you tend to notice that others don't have it. But the instruction was meant for you. So why is that? So as we discussed last week, it's because our senses look out instead of in. So we more easily notice others' faults. So like we're saying, sometimes we don't notice our faults at all. And other little faults of people we notice quite easily. And that's just the reality of our conditioned existence. And so Now, when you take a course in anything which is meant to improve something, it could be japa, it could be anything, that you'll learn about the faults and you'll learn about what you should do. And the problem is you tend to notice the faults in other people. Yes? Yeah, now you're aware of the faults. So just think about it. All the instructions were meant for you to acknowledge the faults in yourself, and now you're acknowledging the faults in others. So what does that say about you? It says you're a sad case, Prabhu, a sad case. You need some work. That's what it says. And so, and if we go back to my original point, but what makes it even sadder is if you do that and you don't even recognize you're doing it. You think, yeah, I went to this class, it was really good, and I'm really upset because I see how poorly devotees are chanting japa. I never realized it before, but it's really bothering me now. Yeah, so that happens sometimes. So immediately, if you're smart, you should understand and say, just see my nature, that I learn something that I could use to improve myself, but instead I use it to see the faults in others. Just see how bad I am. That's how you should think. Okay. Now, the other point of, there's a couple points being made in this explanation, but one point is being made is that everybody has some faults. So you focus on that fault, that's your fault. You don't say, but Prabhu, they have a fault. No, but it's your fault that you're focused on their fault. If their fault is just like generic, it's not destroying other devotees, it's not tearing apart the movement, it's not abusing anyone, then the real fault is that you're focused on their fault. Simple, right? Make a t-shirt. The real fault is you're focused on their fault. It's your fault that you're focused on their fault. You're at fault for focusing on their fault. All right? That's important realization to have. You know, we're looking at someone's fault, but sometimes our mentality is worse than the mentality that they had that caused them to do whatever they did that you don't approve of. Okay, so Ashalata is going to add some maybe balance to this equation, but if we have to say something, we should go to the person directly and not write emails about it. I mean, person only gets a chance to develop if you talk about the issues. But if you live in Germany and I live in Mayapur, well, we could Skype about it, I guess. But you know, email is such a common form of communication that often we have communications with people that are only on email. So, as a result of that, sometimes, well, one devotee was saying, he was making a joke, he was saying like, oh, there's a story, it's an interesting story. He said, I don't know if a devotee said this or who said it, but it's a really good story. He said that a father got a letter from his son who was in college, and I guess the boy didn't speak the father's language, so he had to write the letter in English. So then he went to a butcher and he said, could you read this letter? So the butcher read the letter, and the butcher's like a rough guy. He goes, yeah, the letter says your son wants money. You know, he says it like that, he just wants money. And so the father was really upset. He's like, he just writes a letter, doesn't say anything, he just wants money. So then the man's going along, he sees some sadhu or some person, and he says, you look really disturbed, what's going on? He goes, read this letter. You know, tell me what this letter says. It's so disturbed, my son just wants money. And then the sadhu person reads it and he says, my dear father, I'm having difficulty and this and that, and I'm challenged with this and that, and you know, if you'd be kind enough to send some money to help me with this situation. So his point was that it wasn't so much what they said, but it was like who was reading it. You know, how you read it. You know, dear Father, just give me the money. Just give me money. I'm in a bad situation. Just give me money. So if you read it like that, and you get agitated. If you read like, oh, I'm in a really bad situation. Could you please just give me some money now? If you read it like that, then different reaction. So we know, all of us who do email, we know that when you read email, you don't have any idea what's going on in the person's mind. There's no tone in it. So they could be saying something which is just neutral, and you could read it as quite negative. Or they could be saying something serious, you could read it as funny. And then you read it, and then you get upset, but it's not what the person meant. So, I'll give you a thought about email. And sometimes I read email exchanges between devotees, and I think, I hope no non-devotees read this, because they would be in shock of how these devotees are treating one another. It doesn't sound like sadhus. You say that because you're this, and you don't understand this, and you've never lived in India, so you can't understand the culture. You're just an American. You all liberal Americans think this way. I mean, I've read emails like that. Worse, also. And I'm reading this thinking, these are devotees. Can you imagine some non-devotees reading our email? What they would think? Reading emails like that, just character assassination and attacks. So where is that coming from? Is that something we learned in Krishna consciousness? No. We learned that before Krishna consciousness, and it hasn't left us. That's the problem. And one of the reasons it hasn't left us is because, as I'm saying, either we don't notice it, or we don't care about it. Like some people get angry all the time. Yeah, easier to talk on Skype sometimes, yeah. So some people get angry all the time. And they say, oh, I get angry, but I don't like getting angry, but I get angry. And I say, no, you like getting angry. Because if you didn't like getting angry, guess what? You wouldn't get angry. That sounds too simple. But it's true. No, I don't like getting angry, I just have a hard time controlling myself. Okay, I'll acknowledge that. But ultimately, if a person is always getting angry and always getting upset, then I would say, you like it, even though you don't like it, but you do like it, at least you don't not like it enough to stop it. Yes? You have the choice. You can discipline yourself, or you can not discipline yourself, and you can just regret your actions. So whenever you find yourself and you're exhibiting behavior which you don't like, don't say, I just don't understand why I behave this way because I don't like it. That's not true. You do like it. You don't like the consequence of it, but you like doing it because if you didn't like doing it, you wouldn't do it. There's something about it that you like. There's something in your consciousness that is forcing you to do that. And I think even if we don't understand, how is it that I like getting angry? It makes me sick, I don't like it. But if we understand there's something about getting angry that doesn't bother me, because that's why I do it. Because if it bothered me, I would stop it. Something about being intolerant that bothers me, then I become tolerant. Like I have this problem on my computer. Well, I go to open my email, right, and then I start to write it, but it doesn't write, and I have to click again. And sometimes it won't write, and sometimes I have to click again, and then the email gets sent. It says, I don't know, maybe I have a bad version of this software for the email. And, I just go with it, I go whatever, And then I was in a rush today, and I was trying to write some stuff, and I'm writing, but the cursor's flying all over the email, and I can't write anything. And I was about to just go, ah! But this happens like 100 times a day to me. But I just tolerate it. And then the thought came to me and said, do you really want to get upset about this? And I said, see, I'm schizophrenic, right? So I had a conversation with myself. So I said, no, I don't. And then the other voice said, okay, then don't worry about it. And then I said, okay, I won't worry about it. Yeah, I get so many blank emails. Yeah, like, I can't control it. The only way I can control it is when I'm responding is to erase your name and then type it back in, because they just, I don't know how they get sent. The cursor's not on the send button. So, but I thought that was interesting. I thought it was an interesting experience I had, which was, you know, it's like, this is happening too much. It's just like, it's frustrating. I'm sitting there trying to write an email, clicking, getting the cursor to just go in the email and type, and it won't. Doing it again, and it won't, and then all of a sudden the letter's sent. And so then I had that realization, well, do you want to live your life being tolerant, or do you want to not live your life being tolerant? Because you decide. And I realized that some people who are less tolerant, if they're going through what I'm going through all the time with these emails being sent and I can't write, they'd probably get really upset. So then the question is, do you want to get upset or do you not want to get upset? Because if you don't want to get upset, then just be tolerant and everything's fine. And as simple as that sounds, it's true. And that's why I say, if you're intolerant, if you're angry, if you're impatient, this or that, in most cases, it's because you can tolerate being intolerant. You can tolerate being impatient. You can tolerate being angry. You can tolerate being proud. You can tolerate being greedy or lusty or whatever it is. You say, no, I don't like being lusty. Well, if you don't like being lusty, you wouldn't be. No, it just comes. I can't control it. All right, it comes. But part of the reason it comes is because you're willing to tolerate it. You're okay with it. It's all right for you. Because if it's not all right for you, it's just, it won't be there. It's true. Think about it. It's important, you know. And if you acknowledge this, then you can better deal with it and say, okay, why am I always getting angry? You said, well, Mahatma Prabhu said, because I'm okay with being angry. I tolerate being angry. It doesn't, you know, I'm not at this point where I say, that's it. We're finished with anger. I can't stand it. It's wrong. It's hurting my Krishna consciousness. It's hurting other people. It's wrong. It's bad. I don't like it. It's against our teachings. It's against our principles. Kama esha, krodha esha, rajagun samudbhava. From kama comes lust. Comes anger. I don't like it. I don't want it. It's not Krishna conscious. At that point, you're going to see there'll be a change in how you deal with things. It's like, because you've accepted to act on a different level. You accepted this is not Krishna consciousness, and I'm willing to act on a higher level. And then you'll find it easy to control your anger. You'll find it easy to be patient and tolerant and self-controlled and disciplined and focused. Because you no longer can tolerate not being focused and not being disciplined and not being patient. So that's why I say, if you're angry, impatient, intolerant, and so forth, it's because you're okay with it. It doesn't bother you. You say, no, Prabhu, it bothers me. And I say, it doesn't bother you. If it bothered you, you wouldn't act that way. What do you say to that? Do you agree? Is that true? Why don't you experiment? Why don't you experiment this week? And try to become intolerant with your intolerance. How's that? Why don't you become intolerant with your intolerance? I no longer can tolerate intolerance. I no longer can tolerate anger. I can no longer tolerate my false pride. I no longer can tolerate my impatience. I no longer can tolerate the fact that I'm so unkind and so selfish. Then, if you think that way, then you'll see that you'll change. Vainarati agrees. And Pollack says, taste is in the root of our every action. Yeah, you only do something if there's something you get from it. The Guru Nisha says, I used to have the same problem with the cursor. Then Greg solved it. He made me disable the touchscreen mouse and instead use a regular mouse. Disable the touchscreen and use an external. Well, we can try that. But I think I've tried that before and had the same problem. Anyway, I can try it. I do have an external mouse sitting in the drawer here. I don't know, probably the batteries are dead, but here it is, everyone, full of dust. We can try it, get a battery for it, see what happens. Dust it off and try it. Be a great discovery. Save you from reading blank emails. Pollack says, can we force that line of thought? When I tell myself I won't be tolerant for that, my mind says that I am tolerant of that for my bad qualities. Yeah, you can control it. You can force it. Because ultimately you're in control. At least you're supposed to be. I mean, in theory, you can be. Yeah. Got it. Disable it from the settings. You see, everything evolves around desire. So Krishna consciousness purifies your desire. And when it purifies your desire, then what happens is you have a desire to act in a more Krishna conscious way. When your desires are not purified, then you can act in non-Krishna conscious ways and it doesn't bother you. It's like this famous story, I probably told it before. It's such a nice story. Prabhupada's walking in Mayapur, and this was, I think it was probably the early days when we had these festivals, and our toilets, as far as I remember, were a hole in the ground, and around that hole in the ground was a wooden box, 6.5 feet high, and wide enough to get in and squat over the hole. So it was something, I don't know, maybe there was some sanitation, maybe there wasn't. So Prabhupada's on a morning walk and he goes by and he sees that this toilet is really dirty. And he says, you should clean it. And they say, we'll clean it later. And Prabhupada said, you should clean it now. And then he said, look at, you're walking by this and you see this is dirty and it doesn't bother you because you should have noticed this. Why did I have to notice this? You should have noticed this. So then he said, if you're in the mode of ignorance, then when you contact the mode of ignorance doesn't bother you because you're in that mode. But if you're in the mode of goodness, then the mode of ignorance bothers you. You get it? You got the idea? Because you're not in that mode. So he said, whatever mode you're in, then things of that mode, they jive with you. So if you're lazy, then by nature you act in a lazy way, it doesn't bother you, or other lazy people don't bother you. It's just the way you are. But if you're sattvic and then you see yourself acting in a lazy way, it will bother you because it's different from your nature. So when you want to elevate your consciousness, then these other lower consciousness activities and thoughts start to bother you, and that becomes the cause of changing them. Does that make sense? And does that answer your question? So in a sense, I'm saying you can't force that line of thought, and in a sense I'm saying, but if you change your attitude or elevate your modes, then the thoughts will adjust themselves to the attitude. They'll reflect the attitude. So if the attitude is, I don't want to be lazy, or I don't want to be dirty, or whatever it is you don't want to be. I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. Whatever it is that you want to change, if you actually in your heart want to change it and you can't accept it the way it was, then yes, your thoughts around it will change. And it's just a natural way to do it. And it doesn't really become a big struggle. It's totally natural, because now it's like, let's say you had children and you weren't raising them properly. You were very mean to them. And so you went to a parenting course, and it taught you how to be kind and loving, compassionate, understanding, and so forth. And so then you realize, okay, this is really going to help with my kids, and they're really going to like it, and I'm going to feel better. And so you really imbibe those teachings and that way of relating, and you want to do it, and you feel good about it. So now you're going to do it. And now when you get angry, you're going to catch yourself. You say, no, I don't want to do this. This is wrong. So because you've changed internally, then naturally you catch yourself when you're getting angry, and you just stop yourself and say, no, this is not the way I want to be. It's not productive. It's not going to help anything. So it's very easy to control. But if you don't come to that point where you say, I want to stop being this way and I want to start being this way, then it's hard to control. Then you can run into that situation where you're doing something wrong and you don't even know it. And you know a million shlokas that will tell you this action is wrong, but it won't dawn on you when you do it. That's the problem, in a nutshell. Okay. Ganesha says, Anuradha says, yes, but, the but word, here it comes. Yes, but sometimes I can see that even you want to change, sometimes your mind has the custom to act in a certain way, and it is not enough just thinking about to change, but it is a process, sometimes slow process. Well, yes and no. And here's the no part. The no part is you want to change, and now you have to act that way every day for a month or two, because you're building a new habit. So yes, your mind doesn't want to go along with it. But, as we said many times, you don't have to wait for your mind to act. And if you act, your mind will come along later. Yes? If you wait for your mind before you act, then you're going to have trouble. But you can act without your mind. That's the whole point. Okay, don't wait for your mind to agree. Just start acting. Then build the habit. I don't know what example you're using, but let's say your mind is acting a certain way. So you see defects in others. Let's say that's your problem. And you want to change, stop seeing it, but it doesn't change. So what do? Well, you practice seeing good qualities, you practice going up to people, acknowledging them for the good qualities, you practice appreciating them, and so on and so forth. So by that practice, you're reconditioning yourself to a new habit, your mind's changing. Right? We taught that in many of our workshops, we taught that principle, that it's often easier to change an action, to act your way into a new way of thinking, rather than is to think your way into a new way of acting. Right? You remember that? To think your way into a new way of acting may not always work as well as acting your way into a new way of thinking. Of course, if you work them both together, they go better. But one of the principles that I'm teaching is that there is a consciousness in which you get fed up with something, say, I don't want to do that anymore. It's just not the way I want to be. And by acknowledging that this is not the way I want to be, then it's much easier to do the proper actions, and it's much easier to control yourself. Think of anyone who's doing something that they don't want to do. Then I would say they don't not want to do it enough to stop. Whereas if you come to a point where you don't want, you really, you might say, well, you're challenged with this problem. You might say, well, I fault find and I don't like it. And I say, okay. But then I go back to my other statement. I say, you fault find because you like it. And if we just acknowledge that whatever we're doing, which is a conditioned behavior, if we acknowledge that we continue to do it, if it's regular, if it's something we're really having trouble controlling, not just isolated, but regular, that means if we're doing it, it's because ultimately we don't care that much to stop it. So I always find myself criticizing. Why? There may be many reasons, but one of them is I don't mind. It doesn't bother me that I criticize others. If you ever come to the point in your life where it actually bothers you, where you realize how bad it is, how wrong it is, you're going to stop. You're just going to say, this is wrong. This is hurting me. It's hurting other people. It's not what Krishna consciousness is about. It's just bad any way you look at it, and you'll just stop. Or you'll minimize it. Because it's no longer fulfilling your needs, it's no longer firing you up anymore, but now it's antagonistic to you. That's the point. Does that make sense? I think it makes sense. Anyway, I would like you all to experiment this week with what I said and try it out on yourself and look at something, some behavior, some attitude you don't like in yourself, and then see if you could not like it so much that you stop doing it. That it gets you to the point where you say, I don't want to do this anymore. It's just not who I want to be. And see if that brings consciousness, if that brings awareness to what you're doing to the point where you have some control. I'm getting applauded now. Wow, that must have been a good answer. Standing ovation, huh? Wow. Okay, so we've gone over time, and I think we covered the topic. And you can all have a good time this week dealing with all the behaviors and natures which you want to remove from your arsenal. And naturally, when you remove them, you replace them with proper behavior, or you could say you remove them by acting properly. Okay, thank you all for attending. Now it's time for me to sweat some more in this hot weather. And I hope you all become pure devotees in the next 5 minutes by implementing everything we said, and we will create a revolution on this planet very soon. Okay, thank you very much, and we are going to say goodbye to all of you, and Hare Krishna.